Perfect.
Yes. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Tiffany. I am a pediatric psychologist here, and I'm here to give a really brief intro on autism spectrum disorders and really open it up to discussion and conversation. I had some great questions that already came in. I will do my best to answer them throughout the presentation. But if we don't get through all the slides because you guys ask questions and we talk instead, that's great. So feel free to interrupt at any time. You don't have to wait till the end or anything like that. I say really brief because we can't obviously talk about everything that has to do with autism in 90 minutes. It's just not possible. So, but we'll do the best we can to address any questions that come up. So a little bit of what to expect today. We'll go through some brief introductions, do the kind of autism 101 and some FAQs. I'll try to address your questions throughout as I mentioned. Talk about some strategies and tools and tips and kind of understanding the whys behind why some of the behaviors might happen that come on the inpatient unit. And then opening the floor for discussion and conversation, as I said. I will have my disclosure slide next, so be prepared for that. And then having some important considerations. I already mentioned the limited amount of time. And a really important one is if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So keeping in mind throughout this entire presentation the caveat that although I'm talking in generalizations, these are not going to all apply to every person with autism by any means. So it's having information to help you kind of understand, but also knowing that the spectrum is very wide as we were talking about. So it gives you an idea, but it's not something that you can then judge somebody by just because they have that diagnosis. There is more variability within the autism community than between autistic and non-autistic. So it's difficult to know just based on a label, but we'll talk a little bit more about it. So keeping that caveat in mind. Language is really important. So when I was in grad school, we talked about person first and saying person with autism, as we would say a person with cancer, or person with diabetes, because we wanted to be respectful in that manner. But then the autistic community kind of came and said, well, hey, that's kind of making it seem like autism is a bad thing. And then it's actually a big part of my identity and it's part of who I am. And you not wanting to include it as part of my identity is actually othering me. And I actually want to be called an autistic person. So some people like to be called autistic, some people like to be called a person with autism. So it's kind of up to the person. So if you know a person, ask them what they prefer. I'll probably use a mixture throughout. But in general, it seems like the kind of pulse of the community is that autistic person is kind of preferred using identity first at this moment. And then clinical questions, if things come up, you're kind of thinking about a particular patient or person. Certainly we can talk about it, but since I probably won't know that individual or have worked with them, I won't have the kind of in-depth clinical knowledge to give kind of in-depth clinical guidance. But certainly we can kind of talk in generalities about some ideas about where to go. Disclosures, I have none, unfortunately. Nobody's paying me. Just a little bit about my background. I'm a licensed psychologist and also a BCBA D, which is a board certified behavioral analyst at the doctoral level. I got my PhD at UW-Madison in educational psychology. I worked a lot with kids with autism when I was there. Did my internship at an institute out in Boston. Worked at a school for kids with autism and developmental disabilities. And then at a school with kids with traumatic brain injuries. Then I went out to the Baltimore area at Kennedy Krieger Johns Hopkins. Worked at a DVD clinic, so developmental disabilities and autism clinic there. Stayed on as a staff psychologist there for a little while before coming back to Belmont. Now I get to do some testing and therapy and consultation and get to come see you guys today, so I'm excited about that. Just a little bit of a poll so I get a kind of a idea of who I'm talking to. Hands up if you work kind of directly with patients in some capacity. Okay, awesome. Hands up if you're mostly inpatient. Okay, all right. Hands up if you're leadership. Okay, security. Okay, if I missed you and you didn't get to put your hand up, tell me what you do.
I'm a behavioral health specialist.
Fantastic. Awesome. Cool. Thank you. All right, so what is autism? The idea of the definition of autism has changed a lot over the last few decades. But it is a lifelong neurological developmental disability, and that it's present either from birth or within the first couple of years after birth. And our understanding, again, has changed over time. There's countless variations of what autism looks like, which makes it really complicated to kind of put into words of what it is. The medical diagnosis of autism says that you have to have differences in social communication and interaction, and then restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. So there's these two sides, and I'll show you the DSM criteria in a little bit. The more kind of nuanced understanding is it's just a different way of the nervous system being organized, and that changes how someone processes information. It changes their experience of internal sensations. So they might experience things like hunger, thirst, pain differently. It changes their experiences of external sensations. So they may experience things like lights, sounds, the smell of Jamie's French fries differently. It changes how they experience kind of those social interactions. Communication style can be different, movement patterns can be different, as well as information processing. And we'll talk through all those in a little bit more detail as we go along. So this is the DSM criteria. I give this to families a lot when I am going over the diagnosis and whether their child met or didn't meet. So they have to have all of these on this side. So they have to have difficulty engaging in back and forth conversation. With underneath is just some examples of what that might look like. Some difficulty with nonverbal communication, and some difficulty understanding social relationships. And on the other side, they have to have 2 out of the 4. So it's repetitive body movements, use of objects or speech that could look like repeating speech, lining things up, insistence on sameness, so rigidity, needing to do things the same way, difficulties transitioning, unusually strong interests, so being really, really, really into something and having a hard time talking about something else. An unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment, so that kind of experiencing that sensory world differently. So really interested in the sensory pieces or having adverse reactions to sensory pieces as well. So some statistics, you probably hear that autism rates increase, and they have increased every time that we look at it, every time the CDC finds these, the data. And there's probably a number of different reasons for that. There's likely a true increase in the number of people who have autism. And there's probably an increase because those definitions are changing, right? And the broadening of who we include in that pool of what is considered autistic. Right now, the most recent data came out in 2023 based on 2020. So what they do for this is they have 11 counties in the United States that they poll, and they're looking at 8-year-olds and asking a subset of 8-year-olds, because there are families with 8-year-olds, does your child have an autism diagnosis? At that time, 1 in 36 8-year-olds was diagnosed with autism. And for every 1 girl diagnosed with autism, 4 boys were diagnosed with autism. As we might talk about a little bit more later, we know that that's an underrepresentation of females. We know that more girls have autism than we're identifying. But that's what we're finding now. In Wisconsin, we had the same number, so it was 1 in 36. And boys were 3 times more likely to be diagnosed at age 8. But there's been some estimates that probably over 2% of the world's population has autism. So you definitely know and interact with people that have autism. And autism doesn't go away, so it's not like it's just a childhood disorder. You have friends and family members possibly that have autism as well. And one thing that I found really interesting as I was researching more into adult autism diagnostics, because as you guys probably know, that's a big topic of concern. There's a lot of adults that are looking to get assessed, is is that our clinical populations, so the populations of people that are seen here, are actually much more likely to be on the autism spectrum than non-clinical populations. Some estimates are up to 20% of people that are in the clinical
Attention,
population.
fire system testing is done. Fire system testing is done.
And there's no medical or blood or imaging tests currently that reliably diagnoses autism. There certainly are brain-based differences that we can see in some scans, but there's not anything right now that says, let's take a picture and I can say, yes, your child or this individual has or does not have autism. And there is no cure for autism, or even an agreement that there should be a cure. You know, there's a movement towards acceptance and neurodiversity, and that autism is just another way of being. And it's not something that we need to fix, it's just we need to figure out a way to adapt to the world, to fit the individuals, and to help the individuals fit into the world as well, rather than something that needs to be fixed in and of itself. So when I'm explaining the diagnosis to parents and sometimes to kids, I use the example of an iOS system and an Android system. So it's not that autism is, there's anything wrong with your brain, it's just that you might have an Apple system and everybody else has an Android system, or vice versa. Nothing wrong with either system, they just don't communicate super well with each other sometimes, right? It's more difficult to share pictures, it's more difficult to talk to Android users. I have no idea, right? I'm an Apple user, so I don't understand their jargon and they don't understand mine, but they can do the same things, it just is a little bit different way, right? One's not better than the other, as much as we might argue about it being the case. It's just a different type of operating system, and the mismatch or the miscommunication comes when one system is trying to work in a world that's designed for the other system. And unfortunately, for those who have autism, is they're trying to live in a world that was not designed for them. And that's where the issues come up, or that misunderstandings come up. There are a lot of comorbidities associated with autism. About up to 80%, and it might even be higher, of people on the autism spectrum have something else as well. So you're not typically seeing just autism. And that could be something that we might think of here, more of a mental health condition or diagnosis, but it's also medical things as well. So people on the autism spectrum have much higher rates of sleep difficulties, GI issues, diabetes, seizure disorders, motor disorders, even like heart issues. So there's a lot of things that come along with being on the autism spectrum, and unfortunately, we have seen that a lot of times medical providers will kind of downplay some of the concerns that get brought up by people on the spectrum or by families of people on the spectrum, because well they have autism and they don't kind of listen to that piece. And as we'll talk about, or we kind of mentioned already, people with autism have a different way of kind of processing their internal sensations. So they might not be able to describe or share with the provider as much of how much pain that they're in. So they might be having an ear infection for weeks and weeks and weeks, and mom or dad didn't even know because they weren't like having the same outward expression as a child without autism might. So then it gets missed, and that can be really difficult for everybody, of course. All right, so I just wanted to do a little bit of a thought experiment. So if you'd like to, you can close your eyes, you don't have to. So I just want to welcome you to the land of Flurb. So pretend I'm taking you to the land of Flurb. Let's say that in this culture, as in most cultures, most of the social rules are not explicit. So they're not explicitly taught to you, but you have to figure them out. But we're going to tell you a few just to help you out. So eye contact is considered to be rude. Every time you say the word the, you're expected to touch your shoulder. But be careful not to smile when you greet or meet someone or when you say goodbye. But be sure to smile during conversation. Additionally, the Flurbians have different sensory needs than we do. They strongly prefer to have very loud music playing all the time. And their preferred room temperature is about 102 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's pretend you're in Flurb, and throughout your day, during every interaction and task, you're trying to cope with all of this. All right, you can open your eyes. Anyone want to share what that experience might be for you in Flurb? Difficult, yeah. Overwhelming, yeah. Overstimulating, yeah. Do you think you're gonna make your best decisions? What? Think you're gonna be like distracted? Yeah. Might have difficulty hearing other people, processing what they're saying.
Right, easily agitated.
Easily agitated, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Might have difficulty with social motivation. I know I wouldn't really want to like go hang out with somebody. I kind of want to be by myself. Probably have a harder time connecting with other people. Probably easier not to connect with other people. I think it'd be easy to be like your authentic, true self. Maybe not as much, right? And in this situation, we kind of helped by listing some of those rules explicitly. But in like real life, autistic people have to kind of figure out those implicit rules. And we might try to teach them, and oftentimes it looks like kind of punishing them and saying like, you did that wrong, right? You were supposed to do it differently. But they're really complicated, and if you've ever actually tried to teach someone social skills, it's really hard to be like, well, actually you're supposed to use eye contact, but in this situation, now you're using too much, so use a little bit less. Well, here you're supposed to be this close to the person, but now you're supposed to back up a little bit. There's these things that we kind of just naturally intuit that aren't easy to explain, and so then it's very complicated for someone who it doesn't come naturally to kind of pick up on. And if you make a mistake, so if you're in FLIRB and you accidentally make eye contact or you forget to touch your shoulder, you'd be considered rude or disrespectful or weird or odd. And you don't want to be like, well, hey, I'm new here, I don't know the rules, I'm just trying to fit in, and I have a headache from the heat and the music. And you might not be able to say that, or if you did, people would kind of think of you as even weirder or more odd for kind of talking out. And you wouldn't be meeting those kind of arbitrary social expectations and be misunderstood and invalidated and rejected. And it's just arbitrary, right? So these are just made up in FLIRB. They're kind of just made up in our society too. And it's just the fact that, again, that autistic people in our society are the minority, and non-autistics are the majority, that it's them that are always expected to do the fitting in. And that they're always the ones that are kind of blamed or faulted when it doesn't kind of go well, when that interaction is awkward. It's never the person, or it's often not the person without autism that is the one that has to kind of make a change or is seen as different, which is considered by a lot of people to be ableism, if you've heard that word. Thank you. All right, I recognize that that's really hard to read. So it used to be that there was all sorts of different diagnostic categories for autism, right? We had Asperger's, we had PD-NOS, we had autism spectrum disorder, and now we have all under an autism spectrum disorder umbrella, and we have levels of support needed. Level 1 is the least amount of support needed, level 2 is in the middle, level 3 is the most amount of support needed. I don't love the level system. I don't think most people do, because it's not an ideal way of communicating, because how much support do you need depends upon a lot of things, right? If you throw me in Germany, I'm gonna need a level 3 amount of support. I don't speak the language, I don't know the culture, I'm probably gonna make some of those cultural faux pas like I would in FLIRB, right? Because I would have no idea what to expect. Day-to-day basis, I don't need much support, but it kind of depends on what's going on, right? Same thing with someone who goes on the autism spectrum. How much support they need depends upon all sorts of things. The situation, the context, the people, how much sleep they've gotten. But it does just give us kind of a sense from looking at a piece of paper, where are we falling on how much assistance kind of in general is going to be needed. Level system is written from a provider's perspective, and that's kind of what I have to use when I'm using the DSM. I like this one, and I'll get a clearer copy to send along with the PowerPoint, but because it's written by actual autistic people, it talks about how much support that they need from their words. So level 1, requiring support, I need help navigating a non-autistic world. Level 2 is requiring substantial support, I need help handling everyday challenges. And level 3, requiring very substantial support, I often need one-on-one support. Any questions so far? Or thoughts? Okay, so we've talked about it as an autism spectrum. Talked about the kind of levels of support. People think of an autism spectrum as like a line, and like, okay, are you a little bit autistic? Are you a lot bit autistic? And where do you fall here? That's not quite what is meant by a spectrum, and I don't do a great job of explaining that, so I rely on people who actually have autism to explain it a lot better than I can. So this is a comic. Can you guys actually read that, or do you want me to read it out loud? I should read it? Okay. All right, so this says, language can be confusing for me. It takes me longer than the average person to process conversations. And although I'm good at making conversation, it can take me longer than normal to respond. But neurotypical people find that language confusing too, and it can lead to some people misperceiving who I am. That is why I would like to explain what is meant by spectrum when we talk about the autistic spectrum. Sometimes when people think of this word, they think of the autism spectrum as being like this. Non-autistic, very autistic. A very linear looking spectrum, which gives the impression that people range from being a little autistic to very autistic. How can you be a little autistic? It's that vague language that I always find confusing. The problem with thinking of the spectrum in this way is the perception of an autistic person also becomes linear. You're only a little autistic, aren't you? I still don't understand. Can you be less vague? You're able to have a normal conversation with me and you act pretty normal. You're not severely autistic. And you see, if someone thinks you're at the low end of the spectrum, this often happens. Archie, you can handle all this just fine. You're not that autistic. And then this says things like new situations, smart, tight clothing, don't stim, be more organized, don't fidget, lots of conversations all at once, lack of routine, too much noises. And there's a lot coming at him on that side, and it's overwhelming to him. How can you be tired? Everyone does this every day. You're just being lazy. Wow, you're being so overdramatic. Get over it. And if you're seen as being on the high end of the spectrum, it can lead to some people labeling you as being incapable of doing anything at all. Whoa, you're more autistic than I thought. I'm going to relabel you on the spectrum. Since you're very autistic, I don't think you should have a job, just to be safe, you know? The truth is, though, someone who is neurodiverse in some areas of their brain will also be no different to your average person in other areas of their brain. So here we have sensory, language, motor skills, perception, and executive function. You see, the autistic spectrum looks something more like this. The spectrum consists of many different traits or ways in which the brain processes information. Some traits create difficulties in everyday life, like being, leading to being diagnosed, but also many traits are useful in everyday life. Each person with autism will have a set of traits all in different areas of the spectrum. The areas where they don't have a trait will function no differently to a neurotypical brain, but may be affected by circumstances. An example, I am good at making conversation, language, but I get sensory overload in loud and crowded spaces, which then makes conversation very hard for me. And so another autistic person might be very happy in loud crowds, but find conversation hard in general. You could say I'm a real party animal. You can see with this spectrum then, that not every autistic person has savant skills, or that someone who can't communicate verbally might still understand what you're saying, but just need a different way to communicate, such as sign language. It shows how not every autistic person acts the same way, and we are all capable of varying strengths and weaknesses. Sometimes if someone is diagnosed as being on the spectrum and informs another person of this, it's so that they can get some understanding and respect for the things they are unable to do. But it is also so that they can cooperate with the world around them, so that they can be the best in the things that they can do. And then at the bottom it says, I hope that in the future people will better understand the term spectrum and continue to respect the differences and similarities we all share in how we experience the world. So I like that because it talks about that there's not just one way of being autistic, and then it's not just one kind of line that you can be more or less of. There's all these different areas. And it talks about how it's context dependent, which it is for all of us, right? Of like, depending upon the situation, how we're going to be able to show it in that moment. So oftentimes when we're thinking about autism, especially I'm guessing the inpatient unit, you're thinking about those big emotional outbursts, big meltdowns, big behaviors, and how do we deal with them. I think it's important to kind of remember, for everybody, but for autism in particular, since that's what we're talking about today, that behaviors aren't coming from nowhere, right? Behaviors are just a manifestation of something else going on. So we think about with autism kind of like an iceberg, right? We're seeing the behavior, but there's all these things going on underneath, and that could be the characteristics of autism that we kind of talked about a little bit, the learning differences, the processing differences, some of those social and communication differences, sensory differences, and those repetitive behaviors and interests, which we'll talk about as we're going through as well. So some of those kind of thinking differences that might show up is processing information in a really concrete and literal manner. So having a really hard time with like figurative language, having a hard time with kind of thinking outside of like black and white. Executive functioning skills are often compromised. So executive functioning skills are things like attention to task, problem solving, organizing, prioritizing, working memory, generalizing, so taking one thing and putting it into another thing. And this is especially true when our emotions are high. Having difficulty making a connection between behavior and consequences, especially true for kids, but also true for adults. Having difficulty applying learned skills in new settings, so generalization again. Having difficulty shifting attention from one activity to another. That can be from a preferred interest to a non-preferred interest, but also from something that we're like stuck on. That could be like a problem, and not being able to kind of move on and being fixated on that. And people with autism often have what's called an uneven cognitive profile, which means some things come really easy and some things are really challenging and hard. That can be really difficult for them and also for caregivers and people working with them, because it's like, well, why could you build this amazing Lego thing that I in a million years can never do, but you can't do your math worksheet? I can be really frustrated. People with autism can have social participation differences. This can look like extreme shyness, so being really isolating and withdrawal. It can look like on the opposite, social inhibition, so not knowing when not to go and talk to someone, or when someone's not really interested in talking with you. It can be confusion, not really sure what to do in the new environment, or kind of not able to pick up on those social cues that we might be able to pick up on more easily. Might be reduced social interactions, or being naive and trusting. So I was at an autism conference this last weekend, and the keynote speaker was talking about how he ended up giving like thousands and thousands of dollars to a friend who was in need, and his dad was talking about how hard it was to watch his child do this, and his adult child, just kind of understanding from an adult perspective and from being dad that wasn't probably appropriate, and then he was probably getting taken advantage of. People with autism might delight in the fine details and might, in their interaction with you, be kind of focused on something that you might find trivial. Like a lot of times, they'll be kind of focused on my badge, or my, like even like the pulley thing on my badge, or maybe wheels on something. They can misread social cues, and we often think about like under-interpreting things, or like not caring or not having empathy. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes it's over-interpreting or having like more anxiety about things because they're caring almost too much or reading too much into the situation. And that can almost be paralyzing because they're thinking too much about what's happening or over-analyzing it. And that's been called, though, it's a double empathy problem. So we used to think that people on the spectrum didn't have empathy, or they didn't care about other people, or didn't understand other people's perspective. We found that's not true at all. People with autism often have more empathy. It's just that they often have a hard time understanding the neurotypical kind of way of thinking about things, that understanding that operating system. But people without autism have a hard time understanding people with autism's way of thinking about things too. So it's this kind of mismatch. And they found that people on the autism spectrum actually do much better empathizing with others on the autism spectrum than neurotypical people do with empathizing with other people with autism. So it's that understanding of the cross-cultural piece that gets in the way. Sometimes they can come across as blunt or rude, kind of being that overly honest and not doing those white lies that we use a lot of times. And they can shut down sometimes when they're feeling overwhelmed or anxious, and that can look, again, really rude and disrespectful to us who are expecting an answer and a response, and then might demand more and more and more, which might just lead to more shutdown. Communication differences. So you might have in your mind a picture of someone who's really quiet or maybe nonverbal altogether, and that certainly can be the case. But people with autism can also be on the other end of the spectrum and be hyperverbal, and maybe not know when to stop talking. And it can be the same within one person, right? One person can be going down from that shut down, won't talk to, then not knowing kind of when to take a breath. Struggling with that nonverbal communication, so body language, tone of voice, personal space. Might have those emotional outbursts rather than being able to express kind of feelings and thoughts. Speaking in an overly formal way, so sometimes when you're talking to someone on the spectrum, it'll seem like you're talking to someone much older than that they actually are, or just kind of like you're meeting in a very formal context, even if it's kind of someone that they know really well. Or alternatively, they might use baby talk, even when they're older and stressed out. Or it could be like a sing-songy, kind of mechanical voice, or just kind of seem a little like off or different, cartoonish at times. They might repeat words or have kind of unique or idiosyncratic phrasing. Just kind of, I often will ask parents, like, did they have their own like way of speaking that you were just like, oh yeah, that's so Johnny, right? Like that just kind of different than other kiddos. Any questions about the kind of first side, the social communication, social interaction piece before we talk about the other side of criteria? Nope. Okay. Restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. So when it comes to the repetitive behaviors, lots of things that you might see could be hand flapping, spinning, finger flicking, could be self-injurious behaviors like head banging, could be things like staring at lights, moving fingers in front of eyes, staring at fingers, scratching, could be lining things up, watching moving objects, could be that echolalia that we talked about, like repeating words. Most of the time, if these things are not hurting a person or hurting someone else, we just want to kind of leave these alone, stimming, because it's a way for a person to cope. And we all stim, right? I tap my foot, I tap a pencil. We all do things, we kind of play with our fingers. They just might not look like this, right? But we all have ways to kind of regulate our nervous system. Kind of old school way of trying to help people with autism, to help them kind of fit in, was to try to kind of do away with some of these things so that they looked more typical. But we have found that actually is really harmful because it's taking away a lot of those coping mechanisms, and it's telling them that their way of being in this world is wrong. So if it's not harming anybody, we want to leave those kind of things be. Strong interests could be things that are like trains, are a big one that we see a lot. Could be clocks, time, that's a big one. But it could also be things that other people are really into as well, but they're just more so, right? So the one that gets really tricky is video games, because what kid is not into video games? But if it's, okay, video games is all I'm going to talk about, and now I am using video games as an analogy for everything in my life, that might be a clue that that's more of a strong fixation than just I'm into video games because that's everybody that all of my friends are talking about that video game. Could also be an interest that like has persisted even though others are kind of over it, right? So adolescents that are still really, really into My Little Pony, or adults that are still really into those kind of younger topics, and have a lot of that collection, start kind of collecting those things and finding their communities online where they're kind of talking about and trading things from that. This also includes things like hyperfixations, so getting like really stuck on something and having a hard time kind of moving off of that topic. Routine-based, so really preferring to know kind of the order that things are going to be in and having a really hard time when that routine is not going to be able to be followed. Difficulty with change or transitions, which could look like if there's a substitute teacher that's really hard, to the extreme of I had a kiddo that when their bus couldn't go the same route to school because there was construction, then we had major meltdowns, and it took us a while to figure out what was going on because this child was nonverbal, so couldn't tell us what was going on and why those major meltdowns were happening all of a sudden on the bus when he had never had issues before. Sensory differences, again, could be more interest in sensory things or less interest, and it could be within the same person, both of those things at different times. And then rigid thinking patterns, or getting stuck and having a hard time kind of moving on or doing things in a different way. Little bit more of a sensory processing. So sensory processing is kind of how our nervous system takes in information from our senses and turns them into the motor reactions and our behavioral responses. If you're hypersensitive, you're overly sensitive to things. If you're hyposensitive, you have that lack of sensitivity. And because of that hypersensitivity, Sometimes people with autism won't acknowledge physical pain or like even physical trauma, so there's been cases where people have broken bones and have not sought medical attention or had their caretakers know that they were hurt because of that. And there's sensory seekers and sensory avoiders, and again, it can be within the same person. So it could be a person who's really needing a lot of input, and then also getting overwhelmed and overstimulated and needing a lot of desensitization as well. You probably know the top 5 sensations. You might be a little bit less familiar with the lower ones, but we also have a sense of balance, that if you've ever had like an ear infection and your balance has gotten impacted, you know how that one can really impact you. We have a sense of where our body is in space, proprioception. So a lot of times people with autism have a different kind of sense of their bodies in space than most people with ADHD too. So they, especially kiddos, might not be aware of just kind of where they are, maybe knocking into things and getting in trouble for being too close and touching others when they're not really intending to do so, they're just kind of not aware. And then interoception, or that state of internal organs and how they're doing, and hunger, thirst, illness, if they have to go to the bathroom, might be one of the reasons why toilet training is sometimes delayed in those on the autism spectrum. All right, so why you're actually here. So what can help? So creating structure as much as you can and sticking to it as much as you can with flexibility. So I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive to have structure with flexibility, but if we as the more neurotypical person can have some flexibility on our end to kind of go with the flow, to help when we can, right, to kind of choose our battles, and have that kind of routine to provide that stability, but be able to not have that hard line and be like, no, we said at 2 o'clock we're doing it this way, right? Things are going to be able to run a little bit more smoothly. And there was a question that had come up, like, okay, well, how do we do that? How do we have that structure when there's different staff that are working with a person? I think that's a great thing, and hopefully we can have some kind of discussion about that. I know in some places I've worked, we've had like a one-piece document that's kind of on a kiddo or a person that we're working with, and like, okay, these are some things we found that really worked really well. This is what we found didn't work. Let's try these things, and even, you know, this is preferred interests, right? We found like he really likes talking about dinosaurs, and maybe try talking about dinosaurs, and just that kind of like quick glance can really help. I know you guys have so much documentation to look through. There's no way you can look through all of that for all of your patients and kind of get that quick sense. But having that one page, kind of know what might help with each patient might be helpful. That was one thought that I had to kind of help with the structure. But I don't work in the inpatient unit at all, so I'd be interested to hear from those of you that do, if you guys have any ideas of things that might help with that structure, that would help with structure and consistency in the team.
I mean, just as a way of distinguishing it, if we found out a patient was autistic, if there was like a color for that page or something, that, like a pink page, and we knew that was the page that had the tips in the schedule, and we didn't have to go looking for it in the notes or anywhere else.
Yeah.
Or if it could just be in their folder.
Do you have like a folder for everybody? Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And are there like, is there tips or like a page for each person that tells you like the main thing you need to know?
Not really, other than just like a general SBAR format when we get the patient.
Okay.
First time.
Because I'm guessing, autistic or not, there's probably patients that it would be good for you to have like highlights, like, hey, make sure you don't say this with this person, or yeah, having like a color coded way to kind of get your attention for that.
Yeah.
That'd probably be helpful. That's a good idea. Ideas
Be a
or?
form that the parents fill out, and we know the deal is best.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's really huge, is working with, if you can, as much as you can, working with caregivers that know the person, especially when you have autism, especially if you have limited verbal skills, because they're gonna be able to tell you, okay, when this is said, this is actually what's being meant, or, you know, when these are some things that are gonna be precursors that kind of give you a heads up that there might be difficulties coming. I think that's a great idea. And some information from parents and caregivers if you can.
And to like from schools also, because a lot of the kids had like IEPs, so they already have behavioral plans. So to know what already is working and not working to those maybe like those ABC trainings or something.
Yeah. Do you guys get that information pretty quickly? Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
It might help to be able to program like school too, because they're already familiar with those, I don't want to say consequences, but those things, I mean.
The visual cue cards as well. I know some schools provide the visual cue cards for kids that have autism.
Yep.
To show what they need because they're in a new environment, they're overstimulated, so
Yeah.
us providing those would help tremendously.
Yes.
Even
yes.
at OT, like going to different places and having the cue cards with them.
Yep. Yeah, I think that'd be great. Yeah, so if you, fantastic, if you can get that information from school, keep things as consistent as you can, it's a great idea.
It would be great when we build Project Fusion, if we could somehow put this on our navigator or somehow, I'm just thinking like if they float from the ER to our inpatient to BBC to the clinic, like then we would all kind of know what we engage and what we gather, how
Yes.
we approach the situations.
I just, the
Yes.
same thing, the Marina.
Yeah, like a banner that big.
A banner or something
Yeah.
that, like what works, what doesn't.
Yep, yeah, and I wanna make sure we're not like stigmatizing, right? in a way,
Right,
but,
yeah,
like,
no.
definitely a way to like, just make sure we're on the same page and helping people be heard. Being clear and concise in communication, so with that processing delay, sometimes you have to wait like 30 to 40 seconds, to really have your message be processed, and then have somebody be able to respond back to you. 30 to 40 seconds is a long time, and it can feel awkward. And I know as someone who does intakes not for inpatient, but for an outpatient setting, that you're trying to get so much information in a short period of time. Sometimes when you're working with this population, you just have to deal with the fact that you're not gonna get everything that you need in that amount of time, and it's gonna take more time. And that stinks, and it stinks in our field that we don't necessarily get paid the same way, and it's, but it's knowing that you're gonna get the information the right way if you give more time. You slow down and you give that space. Because if you just keep repeating the questions, or you're repeating additional questions, or getting frustrated that they're not responding, you're gonna lose them, or they're just gonna start giving you random responses, and you're not gonna get the information that you want, and you're not gonna be building that rapport that you're looking to build either. And then being aware that some people have learned to give kind of scripted responses, and so their answers might be misleading or random. So sometimes individuals, especially less verbal individuals, will just say yes or no, and that might be kind of meaningless. So you might have to ask the question again in the opposite format and make sure that the answer still matches. Because if it doesn't, then that tells you that that answer probably wasn't correct. And be clear that trying to be as clear as possible and not using that abstract language as much as you can, which is really hard when you're talking about mental health concepts. Because you know, I had somebody call me in once when I was out in Baltimore because they were very concerned that the patient was suicidal, and turns out that the patient had been given a whole long spiel and they were just talking about a video game the entire time. And they'd gone for like an hour. But then I just had to, you know, once I asked like, is this the game that you're talking about? Yeah, what's the game called? And they told me, and I looked it up, and it was like word for word verbatim of like what happened in this game. So you have to kind of be looking out for some of those things too, and knowing that those responses might not be exactly what you're looking for. When you're actually doing your work with a person with autism and trying to teach skills, I've had lots of people on the spectrum tell me that they much prefer when we have activities in our therapy sessions together, like they come in and we have a worksheet or an activity that we're gonna do, rather than like just being expected to sit and talk to me, because talking and coming up with a conversation and that expectation is big demand, and like I don't know how to fill this space, and I don't know what you want from me, and like now my anxiety is high and I'm not knowing what's expected here. But if I have like fill in the blank, or like, here is concrete, black and white, here's what we're gonna do, and then you can take this home with you so you can actually put this into practice. Much more likely that it's actually gonna be useful than just kind of a time fill. So having actual worksheets, visuals, are gonna be helpful, planned activities, things that are broken down into smaller steps, more kind of piece by piece rather than big picture, are gonna be more helpful for the most part. Any questions or thoughts on any of that? I've got another page of ideas too. Yeah. I already talked about kind of taking things more slowly. One thing I think would be really helpful, maybe it's already something you do, is like having a social narrative or a social story about what to expect when you're inpatient. And this kind of goes to, this is probably later in the presentation, but universal design, which is a lot of these things that would be helpful for people on the spectrum would probably be helpful for a lot of people. People don't know what to expect when you go inpatient. I work in this field and I don't really know what to expect when you go inpatient. So if you had like a social story or a social narrative that had with visuals, okay, you're at Bellin Psychiatric Center, this is what to expect. First you're gonna talk to fill in the blank. You could have like a blank, put the name of the person that's gonna be the intake specialist that day. We're gonna talk for about this much time. Here's some of the questions they're gonna ask. Then we're gonna go, whatever comes next, find your room. I don't even know. Here's some pictures of what the unit's gonna look like. And then having that available to kind of walk through. And that could be something that's either potentially like sent to families beforehand, because I know that sometimes there's a wait before they can come in for their intake appointment, so that they can kind of be starting to prep the patient of what to expect when they're, so that anxiety isn't building so much in between, because it's pretty scary to be, for the family and for the child or person to be coming in, to kind of know what's going to be happening. And then that could be something that they have here too, so they kind of know what to expect for their day, that has that kind of some of that structure to it. Limiting use of perfumes and fragrances so that senses can be really a big piece of it. So if they're in a group session and someone has a big heavy fragrance on or is eating french fries, they're not going to be able to focus as much potentially. So kind of watching that. Touch was a question that came up. So touch is one that some people on the spectrum really like and desire, like a lot of kind of intense touch. And some people are like, don't you dare touch me. Even like a little tap on the shoulder is very, very aversive. And sometimes it's the same person, it depends on the context, right? So again, limiting unnecessary touch unless it's appropriate, and then communicating, right? So I'm gonna be tapping you on the shoulder, or I'm going to be touching your arms, do this, so that that person knows what to expect and can assent or not if appropriate, can be helpful. Checking lighting, anything that's flashing or too bright or too dim could be impactful. Limiting fluorescence, I know that's not something we use anymore, thankfully. And then building rapport by connecting on preferred interests. So this is another one. I know that our time is limited. I know we're trying to teach a lot of important skills, but if we take the time to talk about whatever it is that they're interested in, and show that we actually care about them as a person, we're much more likely to actually be able to teach those skills than if we are just trying to shut down that talk all of the time. So having that rapport, and you can use those preferred interests to teach those skills that you want to teach as well. So I'll show you a visual that's kind of talking about coping strategies using someone's kind of preferred interests too. Much more likely to be able to actually use it in real life if it's kind of built in with what they actually care about, and if it's more abstract and just like, just kind of, when you're upset, take deep breaths, right? If you can, Power Rangers take deep breaths when they're upset. If they're really into Power Rangers, that can help. And then giving transition warnings, right? So in 10 minutes, we're gonna go to group. Okay, in 5 minutes, group is gonna be done, and then we're gonna go do this. Those can really help. Using a visual to do that if possible. I use time timer. It makes any amount of time a circle, and the circle ticks down. So it really shows how much time is left rather than just saying it, because time is really abstract, especially if you're on the spectrum or you have ADHD. So having it as a visual makes it a lot clearer what to expect. Some other important factors, that relationship matters. Obviously, you guys know that, you're in this field. being aware of self-fulfilling prophecies. So because you know someone has autism, or because you heard that they had a rough day last night, or because you read their IEP and saw that they had this many behavioral incidents, just you know this, but being aware of you going into it expecting them to be a certain way, and then engaging in them in that way, or being aware of your bias that because they have autism they don't care about connection, or that they're not going to be kind, or they're not going to care about you, which that's not true. So just being aware of those things, and when in doubt, responding with empathy and seeking understanding, right? So when in doubt, when there's been a behavior, when there's something that's happened, like, hey, what was going on for you there? Like, how can we kind of work together to understand that, versus kind of your own visceral reaction of what happened and taking it personally. Fresh starts, not having grudges is super important when working with the autism population. It's also really hard because we're human too. But if you can practice and model, like, yeah, that was really rough. Okay, that was rough. We're moving on. Fresh start. Now it's a new moment. That's going to teach them an important skill. It's also going to just start things off in a better spot for you guys as well, because otherwise we're just kind of always starting from a negative place. Names and smiles, just like for anybody, everybody loves hearing their name, right? And being smiled at, and people with autism are no different. So those connections matter. Trying not to take things personally. Having that growth mindset and encouraging that in this book on the spectrum too, right? So even though this is hard for you now, it's something that you're working on, something that you don't have yet. And then universal design, like I mentioned, so many of the things that talked about and that we'll continue to talk about probably would help all people, and a variety of people, so things that could be helpful for more than just those on the spectrum. So we talked about visuals, that was brought up a few times, so here are some examples of visuals that can be really helpful. So a quick first then board. This is an electronic choice board, so giving choices of what they might want to do for a free time. A little bit of a schedule board. I wander choice board, that's the time timer, that's the analog version of the time timer that I talked about. There's some other first boards. It's really hard to communicate feelings when we're upset. That's for all people. Especially hard if you're on the autism spectrum to communicate feelings. So even those on the autism spectrum who are highly verbal might have a harder time communicating emotions. So if we can make it easier to communicate with the use of visuals, these are from the Autism Society of Greater Wisconsin. So it's just as simply like yes and no and help, I want to be alone, I need a break, I'm lost. There's a scale with some smiley faces for how they're feeling hurt-wise. So things like that can be helpful to have available. It was mentioned visuals from school about kind of zones of regulation is probably one you guys get a lot. I'm imagining lots of schools use this. It's not my favorite, but they don't ask me. So zones of regulation is one that lots of schools use, so that might be ones that you want to use here as well. I use a lot of thermometers here where I have different levels of feelings. A lot of times people with autism feel like they're either one way or the other, and there's no gradients, right? They're either happy or they're mad. So really working on identifying that you can be a little bit mad, and you can be, you can even be happy and mad at the same time. That's really hard. These systems are great, and they're really important, but it's important to know that just having a visual in front of somebody doesn't make this usable, right? It's something that's being taught, and a lot of times people, and especially people who are going to be here, they're still working on this. So not expecting this to just be the answer to put it in front, and then what zone are you in? They might not know because they don't have that ability to look inside yet and identify how their body is feeling and what that means. And if they do know, they might not know what to do about it, or be in the spot where they want to do what they know that they should do in that spot. So just kind of remembering that this is something that's being worked on, but these visuals can be helpful for kind of checking in on that emotional state, especially when they're calm, to kind of start teaching these and start introducing it when they're just mildly upset, because if somebody would show me one of these when I'm at a 10 and ask me to show how upset I was, I'd probably throw it at them too. So. I really like the Incredible 5-point scale. That's my favorite of the systems because it is one that you can tailor to the individual person. So this was one that I did with a kiddo using his preferred interests. Can't remember exactly why the crab was his number 5, but so he picked pictures for each one and then wording for each one. So 1 is that he was doing great, 5 is he's ready to explode, and then we wrote like what that felt like for him and what he needed to do at each of those levels. And this is a free resource. You can go to 5pointscale.com and there's templates that you can get and ideas on how to make them kind of work better. And it's got some research behind it as well. So something that could be done on an inpatient on the inpatient level for people as well, and something that they can take home to help. I use visuals when I'm teaching coping strategies because I don't know about you, but when I'm really upset, I have a hard time remembering things, and certainly people on the spectrum are gonna as well. So instead of just telling people to make good choices, having like a stoplight, stop, think, and choose. So first we gotta stop, calm down, take some deep breaths. We gotta think, what are our different options? What are gonna be the consequences of each of those options? And then we have to choose what's the best choice, and then check in with somebody that care about how well did that go? What are we gonna do differently next time? Oftentimes if you tell somebody to take deep breaths, it's gonna like, so having a visual of how to do that can be helpful. Oftentimes people on the spectrum can come across as blunt or rude, like we talked about, unintentionally. So have what's called like a social filter checklist. So checking in, like, am I presenting as calm? Are my words kind and respectful? Is my attitude calm and respectful? Body language, face calm. Am I not glaring and eye rolling? Yeah.
I just have a question for you.
Yeah.
I know, or I've heard, with children who do not suffer with autistic tendencies, that it's easier to practice deep breathing on your back. Is that true, like lying on your back?
Interesting.
With a stuffed animal on your stomach?
Because you can see it go up and down.
But I don't know if that would be the same for somebody who's struggling with autism.
Honestly, I will take it however kids want to do it for me.
Okay.
So if they want to do it like standing on one foot, I'll take it.
I did recently looking for some research and I
Yeah.
noticed that, and it helped me at my home with my son.
I love it.
So-
That's awesome. I mean, I guess that makes some sense, but I will, I think the hardest thing for kids in general is getting them to practice these skills. So if laying with a stuffed animal on your stomach is gonna make it what you wanna do, awesome. I think incorporating like movement, so oftentimes I'll have kids like practice with their hands and like we're raising the balloon up and then we're lowering it back down.
'Cause breathing is a tricky one, isn't it?
It's very tricky. It's so easy for us to say,
Yeah.
but how many of us actually take the time to take deep breaths and do it well?
Yeah.
It's really hard. So it's one thing to say and it's another thing to actually practice it and practice it when we're calm so that we can use it when needed. And, There's a lot of good videos out there. There's YouTube is a great place to look for kid-friendly breathing exercises. Thankfully, schools are doing a great job. A lot of our school districts are doing a great job of teaching mindfulness skills and breathing skills. So a lot of times kids will come in and teach me ones that I didn't know. Oh, that's awesome. I love it. So anything they'll let me if you want to do it. I had one, we were doing it with Pokemon Go. We would breathe while we were walking to catch a Pokemon, and then like stop and like hold our breath while we were waiting to see if it would come out of a Pokeball. Whatever.
You get this correlation.
Right? Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to make you want to practice, I'll do it. So I love that.
I'm eager to learn more.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. Great idea. Thank you. Other ideas, thoughts? All right. Some de-escalation, reducing sensory overloads. This could be things to consider when we're starting to get to that place of a emotional meltdown or a big behavior, or just we're thinking like we're getting to kind of sensory overload, which might look like covering ears, head down, shutting down, stopping. They're not communicating as well anymore. The one I have to remind myself about a lot is just shut up. I gotta stop talking, limit my language, stop trying to have a conversation or ask what's going on, and have more visuals, have visuals available. Certainly check in, like I'm here when you're ready, but not continuing to try to problem solve, because when you're in that spot, you can't problem solve. So giving some space, and really limiting language is the kind of probably the most important thing. Having non-confrontational body language. So oftentimes these shutdowns, these meltdowns, people with autism can look confrontational towards you. So naturally our reactions can be to kind of get, ourselves kind of in a place where we're looking confrontational or we're looking defensive. But if we can kind of have a relaxed stance while keeping ourselves safe, and I know you guys are trained in CPI and those kind of things, so we're kind of presented as relaxed and calm, but present, that can be helpful. If you can be on the same level in a safe manner, that's helpful too. So if the person is kind of like on the ground or crouching, and you can safely be at that same level rather than towering over, that's gonna be helpful. If you can change the setting in a situation, that's probably the best thing that you can do, because it's really hard, remember, to switch topics, switch from that fixation. So if we're stuck on something, rather than trying to work through that and get to something else, if we can go take a walk and then come back to it in a little bit, that's probably going to be most beneficial, rather than trying to kind of work through it and just get stuck more. Power, these power dynamics and trying to like continue to wrestle for like, but I said we were going to get through this. It's probably just going to make everybody frustrated. And people with autism generally win those, so it's not often worth it. Preferred topics can be helpful if you can start kind of bringing up some of those things or having them at least available. Sometimes that can be helpful for shifting gears a little bit. Limiting demands, including questions. Like this goes to the first one again. So I'm a psychologist, I like to talk, I like to ask people how they're doing, I like to ask questions about what's going on. Questions come across as demands, especially when social things are hard for you. So even questions like, how are you? What's your favorite color? What did you do today? Those are demands. We're demanding an answer. And when that's tough, and especially when you're emotional, that is anxiety producing, and that's gonna raise it up. So if I'm already upset, or I'm already feeling overwhelmed, now I'm having more things thrown at me. So don't wanna give a demand. I might notice instead, wow, it looks like you're feeling really stressed out, versus are you feeling stressed out? Then they can choose to say, I'm not stressed out, I'm mad, right? If they want to. And then I'm like, okay, thank you for letting me know. Versus asking, it's gonna be more helpful. Introducing movement if we can. So you guys all know the importance of moving our body and how that can help release some of that energy and kind of get us to a different state too. So again, if we can go for a walk, if we can throw a ball back and forth, if we can do something safely to kind of get some of that energy out, that's gonna be helpful. Yeah.
Do you think that that's important in our school settings, even for children who don't suffer from autism? Like we are still doing things so old school, expecting a child to just sit through the classroom throughout the whole day. When you think about how difficult that would be, even as an adult, to do that.
Yeah, I can't do it. Yeah.
I mean, how can we shift that in our school systems? I think it is a little bit,
Yeah.
A little bit, but it's.
Yeah, I think, schools are doing a better job of kind of understanding that we need to have our bodies moving.
Or have like a break space, you know what I mean? Like I can leave this room if I need to and come back.
Yeah.
Like that type of aspect for anxiety specifically.
Yeah, I almost put it in here. So there's, I don't know if you guys knew about, Miss Archie. It was like whole body listening. Used to be the thing that was taught, like you need to be like sitting still and looking, and ears listening, and eyes on the speaker, and like it was, and then it was I think it was Archie. Archie's taught about ableism, and it was like, actually, you can listen while walking, and you can listen while moving your body, and you can listen while not looking at a person, and all these things that we thought were really important to like pay attention and learn. Actually, for some people, are actually hindering them from learning because they're so focused on trying to stay seated and looking at someone when that makes them uncomfortable, and kind of keep their body in this little tiny space when it's not right for them right then. They're not actually able to learn or focus. So yeah, I think people are being more understanding. And I love that there's a box of fidgets there, and that you can get up. And I was just at a conference, and granted it was an autism conference, but there were people out milling about, and nobody was like, you're supposed to sit here the whole time. And I had my computer out and was doing stuff during it, cause I can't sit still for that amount of time. So I think, yes, I think movement is important and being understanding of that, and
I'm just so glad you're bringing this up, it's very refreshing.
yeah, I think it's a really important thing for us all. And being okay with ourselves to like, kind of give ourselves a break too, like, it's okay to not have to be perfect, like sitting still. Giving space if safe, a lot of times that's the best thing we can do is just kind of let things die down a little bit. I know that's not always safe, but if possible. You can turn on the lighting, that can really help. If you have headphones to kind of reduce noise, that can help. There's swinging or rocking opportunities, that movement can be calming. One thing to be aware of with any of the kind of like sensory swing, sensory movement things is just because we were talking about the hyper and hypo sensory pieces, you just have to know your person, help them to learn themselves too. Because if you're overstimulated and then you do something that's more stimulating, that's not gonna help, right? If you're understimulated, you do something stimulating, great. You have to find what takes you to the right spot. So if you're too stimulated, you gotta find something that calms you down. And if you're not stimulated enough, you gotta find something that brings you up, obviously. But what that looks like is gonna depend upon the person. So you have to sometimes take a little bit of trial and figure that out. Like I talked about before, really not punishing, and by punishing I mean like, just making negative comments about it, telling them to stop, any non-harmful self-stimulatory behaviors, because those are regulating. So things like flapping, tapping, echolalia, rocking, walking back and forth. Providing safe fidgets, love it. I don't know if this is possible or safe. I don't know what the rules are, but if you can provide comfort items from home that are appropriate, so that it is something that, for a lot of people on the spectrum, they have their stuffy that they've had forever, and it's been through war with them, and they can't go anywhere without it. So I can't imagine how difficult it would be to be here in such a scary spot without it. So if there's possibility to have those things. Reducing eye contact. So a lot of times eye contact is hard for this population. So especially when they're upset, not forcing it for one thing, and then not, making it look like you're staring at them. And trying to make sure that other people aren't staring as well. And removing unnecessary people, backing out, giving space. Thoughts, questions, ideas on any of that stuff? Yeah.
So when you talk about giving space, well physically, but also the space and time for like when they need time to respond to questions you ask.
Yeah.
What have you found has been very successful? Like sometimes I'll try to count in my mind just to keep me busy from asking more questions, because for me it's very habit. What we're looking for. It's a habit. It's a habit for me to keep asking questions if someone's not. One thing that I've done is if they use a fidget and that helps them, then I'll use a fidget. But I don't know if you have anything that you've done that would be helpful.
Yep, I'll doodle. Cause I'm not like I always have to be busy. So I have a doodle, or I have my computer in front of me and I'm like working on my intake note. Like, so I'm like, feel like I'm being productive.
Especially because you mentioned eye contact, and I'm like, okay, don't
Don't stare at you,
them,
yeah.
because they know they want, the
Yeah.
time to process and
Yep.
all that good stuff.
Yep. And sometimes if I'm not sure, because sometimes they're not actually gonna respond to you, and it's hard to know. I'll say, hey, are you still thinking? Or do you want me to move on, right? And then if they still don't answer, I'll give us a little bit extra time, like, okay, I'm just gonna move on, but if you wanna go back to that, let me know. And that can help. Sometimes I'll have I'll like write down the choices. Like, I'm still thinking, or I don't want to talk, let's move on. And then kids sometimes touch. Sometimes if I think we're just like stuck and we're not getting anywhere, like if they just like shut down, I'll say, I'm gonna go grab something from my office, I'll be back in a few minutes. If that's safe to leave. Usually parents are in there. And then I go and come back, and sometimes that just helps kind of reset things. Sometimes sometimes it's something I said. It has I would have no clue that it was something that I had said that had triggered them. I would have never guessed that it was that. Sometimes it's nothing to do with me at all. Sometimes it's they didn't know how to respond to that question. So it can be difficult. And it can be really hard when you're like, I gotta get this done, right? Like, it's kind of reminding yourself what's more important. It's here. I'm not gonna get it anyway, so I better take a step back. Yeah, I have to have something, because otherwise I'm too like, okay, one.
One sound.
Yeah, right. It's tough. It's tough. Say too, like especially in like therapy context, if I'm with somebody who takes a long time, and especially if it's not just a slow processor, but someone who's pretty non-responsive, and I will say like, hey, I'm gonna be over here, and I have coloring books too. I'm gonna be coloring. I'm here for you. I'm always ready, but I'm just gonna be here, ready whenever you are, so that they know I'm not just like ignoring them, but it's not this like, right,
Give me an acknowledgement.
yeah, because I know it's super awkward.
That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Other thoughts, kids? Just some comments on restraints. So autistic adults have told us as in like the field of mental health and ABA, about trauma of being restrained, especially as children. So that's something to keep in mind, and try to use caution, as I know that we all do. And I think our numbers here, as we talked about, are really, really low. And my clinical experience is something that you might not necessarily think of. Is I had some individuals I worked with that actually would engage in behaviors in order to get restrained, because it was the only time they got that deep pressure that they really were seeking. And because someone had asked a question about like, some people really like that touch, and that can be really difficult because we're so scared to touch people and to have that pressure. So some individuals that I was working with were actually seeking that out because it was the way that they could get. So then we had to work with, once we figured that out, how can we get them that touch and that pressure in a way that's safer and more appropriate. So we actually got one of those body socks that they could kind of go into, and then use of like weighted blankets and things that helped. Wasn't the same as the actual having 8 people touching you, but it reduced aggression pretty significantly. And then also a particular form of attention. So it was kind of reinforcing for some individuals, because it was the time when you get like 8 people running at you versus when you're kind of one-on-one or getting kind of ignored for a behavior, which is something that often gets done, right? But most of the time, people are not liking restraints, right? And are can fight against it. And something to be cautious about is, because of all those medical comorbidities, a lot of times there's a trunk differences in people on the spectrum, and when they can't be as aware of their internal sensations, sometimes people can get harmed on the spectrum and not be as able to communicate that in restraints. So be really cautious with asphyxiation and making sure that we're doing things appropriately, which I know that you all are, because of those difficulties kind of noticing sensations. Just some helpful assumptions, just kind of in general, is presuming competence. So with people with autism, people with intellectual disabilities, people with limited language, it can be really easy to be like, okay, so they can't do this or they don't understand this, so I'm going to just talk to mom or dad, or I'm going to talk to their caregiver, or I'm not going to bring up this thing. But we don't actually know, just by kind of basic information, how much they understand, or how much intelligence someone has, or what their skill set is. So it's much better to presume that they are competent and understand something than to make the error in the opposite direction. So I will always, when I go out to greet a patient, always greet the patient, right? And then greet the caregiver. I always talk to the patient and then the family as well, but it's, the patients are patient. And then you have to change things, you have to adapt things, sure, but you want to presume that there's that competence there rather than the opposite. If you want to click one more time, I changed the picture. I couldn't find one that said people do well if they can. But people with and without autism do well if they can. So if we assume that, it really changes how we view everything. It can be kind of annoying sometimes because you're like, oh, I can't just be mad at people. But if you kind of have that assumption that people are doing the best that they can, and they don't have the skills or the abilities right now to do better, gives you a lot more empathy and understanding, and then you can kind of figure out, well, what's actually getting in the way, and how do we address those things, rather than just thinking, this person's out to get me, or this person's a bad person, or whatnot. Excuse me. Meltdowns, tantrums, big behaviors, they happen for a reason. The reason is probably not because they got up and they want to make your day worse. And all behavior serves a function or a purpose for that individual. And it's often not a conscious choice. So we talk about function, especially in the behavioral world, which, you know, I'm a behavioral analyst, I'm pro ABA, but oftentimes it comes across as like, this is a choice, like, well, I'm doing this to get attention, or I'm doing this to get access to this, or I'm doing this to get away from this. But it's not because I'm deciding to do it, it's just because my behavior's been reinforced for this in the past and it's worked. We all do things, right? We all, you know, wear something that someone complimented because they got a compliment. It doesn't mean we think about it. It just is behaviors that get reinforced continue, behaviors that don't get reinforced don't continue. Behaviors, meltdowns, tantrums, they're not fun for the individual. So again, they're not doing this because it's their way to get their joy of the day. So it's not fun for you, and it's very difficult for you, and it's also not fun for them. It's not about you, and so try not to take it personally. And you know, when you go home at the end of the day, trying to remember that. And behavior serves as communication. So when people don't have the communication, the skills that they need in order to share those really difficult things, that's what we use, right? That's how we come into this world, and that's what we rely on when we don't have other ways to do so. And we would all get to that point, right? And if you send me the flurb and no one's understanding what I'm needing, I'm going to engage in behaviors to get what I need eventually, right? So, and replacement behaviors are necessary to change behaviors long term. So what that means is we can't just like say or punish a behavior. We have to be able to teach skills, which I know is a lot of what's in here too, is coming up with treatment plans and coping skills and teaching those things that we can do instead of those behaviors that we don't always see. Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes, a little less left. Questions, thoughts, other things we want to talk about? I don't have to do this next part. Just talk. Yeah.
I have a question, just a little bit different. Like someone that's a savant, are they autistic but on like steroids kind of?
I like that way of thinking about it. Yeah, so a savant would be somebody who has, you don't have to have autism to be a savant, but autism savant or an autistic savant is somebody who has autism but they have something that they're like especially amazing or expert at, right? So they could be, they're a savant at memorization of mathematical facts, and they can do like mathematical equations that other people can't do in their head, right, like that. Or it could be musical savant. So it's those kind of splinter skills, but they might not have those other skills in other areas.
I mean, I know they can draw an entire like city from a picture, looking at it and then turning away, and you can draw it. That's just beyond my comprehension.
Yeah, it's incredible, right? Yep. Yep. So true that some people on the autism spectrum are savants. Also true that there's another subset of people on the autism spectrum that just have skills that are just incredible, that wouldn't reach maybe the level of savants, but have skills that I don't have by any means. Like I have someone I know that has autism that if you give him a date, any date, he can tell you what day of the week it was. So you can say like June 20th, 1988, and he can tell you what day of the week it was. And then I have to check. And that's my birthday, and I don't know what day it was. June 20th, 1988. I think it was a Tuesday, but I'll have to double check. And there's people that have like digits of pi to like the thousands, and that they just can rattle those off. Train schedules memorized. Like there's lots and lots of skills, it's like kind of splinter skills that people have. that may or may not be considered savant, but that can be really, really extraordinary. And so that's again like why it's just a different way of being, right? Or who's to say that brain is, that there's something deficient with that brain? Like someone would be like, well, there's something deficient with my brain. Like, why can't she know that, right? Well, she needs an IEP.
That's kind of what you're describing. It does kind of, if you guys don't mind me self-disclosing, that kind of describes my brother. Back in the day, I think if he was properly diagnosed, it probably would have been Asperger's. But now, of course, that's changing. He fully admits social contact. People is extremely difficult for him. But he is so good with computers that President Obama heard of my brother and sent his guys.
Wow.
Yeah. He can like decode, like, or like put things in layman's terms, like, yeah. So it's like these computer skills. He can think how many steps ahead. You know what I mean? I can think one or two. He can think. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just bizarre. That's how people can do that.
That's incredible.
It's crazy.
Sometimes, I mean, I have people that try to explain like Dungeons and Dragons to me, and like the amount of detail in these games and like these characters, and I'm just like, I need a visual aid. Make me a visual, because I don't understand. But it's incredible. Like, so it's just that's a great question. I think that those special interests and those things that people can pick up on. I know some kiddos on the spectrum that really struggle in school and can like take apart electronics and put them back together. What other thoughts, questions? No, come on, I'm sick of my slides.
I know this is preaching to the choir, and it's probably preaching to the choir of this group, like, the amount of information that as a system that we lack of the knowledge. I'm just thinking like somebody enters our hospital and how do we help them de-escalate before they even get into any of our treatment areas? Like, obviously the treatment and the education that our whole system probably could benefit from is astounding.
Somebody asked about puberty. That was a good question that somebody sent in. Can you go to the last slide, please? We're gonna skip this stuff. Although I didn't work really hard on this, but go through it later. Somebody sent in a question about puberty and autism and asked if puberty can impact autistic presentations. And yes, absolutely it can. And I think the most important thing I want to say about this is that your body age and your executive functioning age, or that kind of like thinking, planning skills age, and your cognitive age are all different. So even if someone is delayed and they're a couple years behind in school, and socially they're still playing with My Little Pony dolls, and they're kind of hanging out with peers that are younger and don't seem as interested in like typical kind of peer behaviors, their body's still developing at the same age. So they're gonna still have those same hormones kick in at the same time. Sometimes there's been some research that says like puberty can kind of happen a little earlier in the autistic population than the non-autistic population. So that can cause some troubles, right? When we have hormones and our body is at this age, but then our understanding, our social and emotional understanding is here. And parents often have a hard time with kind of understanding their child as a sexual being who's now having these feelings and not knowing what to do with them. Like, that's really difficult. So really making it important to teach skills, safety skills, who can see you naked, private versus public behaviors, really explicitly, because again, abstract language is really hard. So being really clear on those things can be really helpful. I really love the Vanderbilt Healthy Bodies Toolkits. They're available for free in English and Spanish online. They have social stories, visuals, really clear-cut, clear, easy-to-use information on working with kids with developmental disabilities and talking about like puberty concepts. This is just an example of a social story that's not from the Vanderbilt one, but just really important things to kind of consider and for families to talk about. It also can impact behaviors. So in females, cycles can impact behaviors. So a lot of times we'll track aggression, and you'll see big spikes in aggression around menstrual cycles.
It's normal for everyone, but.
Right. True. And in males oftentimes, or I shouldn't say oftentimes, but I've certainly seen, especially in males who are, lack of a better term, like lower functioning or have less verbal skills, that if they start to have kind of hormones increasing, they're having more sexual needs, but they don't know how to take care of that. Sexual frustration can build up, and then they can have more behaviors because they don't know how to kind of deal with that energy. So really having to have conversations and teaching and with appropriate manners. So they talk about, go to like sexuality conferences and intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. Anything that you want them to know when it comes to this topic, you need to start working on 5 years beforehand. That's, you know, if you want somebody to know something at 13, it's 8. So start kind of working on those things early, which is really, really hard for parents to hear and to deal with because it's your little baby, especially when they have delays. So, but that was a really great question that somebody had sent in, so I want to make sure I address that one too. Yeah.
So I worked here for longer than I'd like to admit. But one of the questions that used to come up more in the past than it does now is if we had an assessment and we would frequently hear, well, this kid has autism, we can't really treat what they need here. Is there, I know you can't answer it specifically for everybody, but in general, do you feel like there could be some detrimental effects to somebody with autism if they came inpatient and were taken out of their routine for a period of time?
I think it's person specific, and I think, you know, inpatient is never what we want for anybody, right? It's the kind of, we are in a crisis, we need to keep you safe, and certainly I've shared it as an option for many of the families I work with kids on the spectrum. I do think it comes with more cautions for if you're on the spectrum. I think it's gonna increase anxiety even more than it would for anybody taking out, because nobody likes to be taken out of the routine, right? But it, even more so, I think that's hard, more difficult. I think that it can be difficult sometimes for those on the spectrum whose behaviors are because they're on the spectrum, to be interacting with or trying to learn with those who are having kind of outbursts and behaviors for other reasons sometimes. So that can be a concern. Sometimes there's, you know, what's the population that they're going to be kind of with when they're here, and is it going to be an appropriate kind of setting? Are they going to misinterpret something, kind of take something the wrong way, or that's not what we're kind of expecting? So yes, there's been times when on paper one of my patients would qualify that I've been like, I don't really think it's the best fit, but I'm cautious in saying something because I also don't want it to be something of like, well, no one with autism, right? Because there's way too much of that in our society, and then there's fewer and fewer places for people to go.
So could it be beneficial where, like, if we had the flex unit available, where they would be one on the staff? Like, just removing them from that situation, working on them.
I think
So
it's,
much of our program is communication, and if those are all aspects that are hard, are they gonna get the benefit that they need?
yeah, it's so person dependent, right? Because again, like there's so much variability within autism. Because I certainly know people with autism that would do well in this situation, you know, as well as people without autism would do. And I know people without autism that would really struggle in this situation. So it's hard to make a hard and fast rule of like, okay, if you have this one label, then you need this kind of plan. So it's more of the, okay, this gives us some insight. You have this label, so here's some considerations we have to have. But it's more of this individualized, now we have to figure out for you what's gonna make the most sense, which is not easy to do when you're, you know, having to have a plan for each person as they come in. But I think it's the only way to do it, because you can't make a snap judgment just because just like you couldn't for any of the other labels. So I'm sure that there's individuals that come in with personality disorders that are actually don't do so well in group with other people. Other labels and stuff. It's a really good question. Yeah.
So I know you talked earlier about, if we know somebody's coming in for an intake, like providing resources and like what to expect. However, I don't know that that's always realistic, because a lot of times people are coming in already in crisis. So is there anything we can do to make it a better transition from outside to inside without being able to prep them for it?
Could you, if you could even have that here, like right when they come in the door, of having like the visual? Because I know that you're probably giving them all that information, but if it's coming verbally, it's gonna be a lot harder to take than if it's like a written with like pictures
Right.
of what to expect. And again, I think that might be something that'd probably be helpful for a lot of people, because I know that when I'm in crisis, I'm not able to process a lot of information verbally
Right.
either. So that might be something. Well, and even, you know, I don't know from a safety perspective, and it's something we have to run through higher ups as we do everything, but if we could even have like, I know places will do like virtual tours of, so you can kind of look, it's a universal design thing too, right? You can look at like, here's what it looks like to go to my dentist's office. You go on the website and here's what to expect when you come to the dentist's office.
We have that now, actually.
We do?
Yeah.
Oh, good job, guys! You do?
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
It's
so-
on YouTube.
That's awesome.
It's called like Balance Psychiatric Center Tour. And it
That's
guides you through
fantastic.
like intake all the way onto the units, cafeteria, everything.
That's perfect.
OT.
Can we
When
figure
did
out a
that
way
happen?
to like let people know that?
We've had that.
It's on the website. It's on our website page. But yeah, I can definitely.
For the last, what,
Probably a year.
About a year.
I know because everyone
Okay.
was wearing masks in the video, so we recorded it right before masks went away.
Okay. So awesome. That's fantastic. So maybe we just need to educate people that that's there, so that they can, you know, and maybe even when you're, you know, when families are calling in crisis and
Yeah.
it's like, okay, you can come in it's 4 o'clock, you can come in at 7 for an intake. Hey, just so you know, there's this video
That's a good idea.
that you might want to watch.
Yeah.
And the link to it.
I think that would be helpful for
Yeah.
everybody, kind of what to expect. I'm gonna watch that. That's great. I had no idea that we had that. That's awesome. I think I'm at my time. Thank you guys so much for all
Thank
your
you.
questions.
For anyone, any nurses that want contact hours,